blood-soaked earth where defiance met destiny. When Jerusalem fell in AD 70, the last Jewish rebels fled to Herod's mountaintop fortress above the Dead Sea. For 3 years, Rome's mighty 10th Legion built an impossible ramp toward heaven, stone by stone, while the Sicarii watched their freedom shrink beneath imperial shadow. As the final breach opened, Eleazar ben Yair gathered his people for history's most terrible choice: surrender to slavery or embrace death as free men. Though the mountain gave up its secrets to archaeologists 2,000 years later, Masada's haunting question remains unanswered. Which demands greater courage, to die for freedom or to endure without it? Smoke drifted above Jerusalem like a shroud stretched over the dying heart of a nation. The wind carried the scent of ash and iron through the ravines of Judea, where even the stones seemed to mourn. From the far cliffs of Masada, the horizon glowed with a faint, unholy red. News had moved slower than the smoke, but every messenger told the same story. The city was gone. The second temple, the place where heaven and earth had once touched, lay in ruins. Rome had broken the mountain of God. 500,000 people had been trapped within the walls, and now their bones fed the crows that circled over the valley of Hinnom. What had been Jerusalem was reduced to rubble and silence. Far to the south, the men and women of Masada felt that silence before they heard the words. The wind carried more than dust. It carried the certainty that their world had ended. They were the Sicarii, the dagger men, those who had chosen the sword over surrender. Their leader, Eleazar ben Yair, stood on the fortress ramparts and looked north, toward the dying light. He did not speak of despair. He told his followers that God's presence had withdrawn into the wilderness, as in the days of Moses, and that they had been chosen to guard the last spark of his covenant. Masada itself seemed forged for that belief. The mountain rose sheer from the desert floor, its summit a lonely table of stone overlooking the Dead Sea's molten surface. Herod the Great had built this fortress a century earlier, part palace, part citadel, meant to outlast rebellion and famine. He had stocked its storehouses with grain and oil, its cisterns with rainwater, and raised a palace of terraces along the northern cliff, where mosaic floors once glimmered in candlelight. To Herod, it had been a sanctuary of fear, a refuge from the people he ruled. To the zealots who came later, it was providence, a fortress already waiting for their defiance. In the first year of revolt, back in 66 AD, the Sicarii had seized Masada in darkness, climbing the steep paths and cutting down the Roman garrison before dawn. They had killed without pity and claimed the fortress as their own. For 7 years they had held it, turning Herod's opulence into a warrior's lair. The frescoed halls now smelled of smoke and sweat. The marble baths stood dry. Yet the cisterns were still full, the storerooms overflowing with old grain and wine. To their eyes, God himself had left them the means to endure. The years that followed hardened them. They raided Roman caravans, struck at outposts, and in their hunger descended upon the oasis of En-Gedi, where 700 Jewish villagers were slain for supplies. Some had whispered that this was not holy war, but madness. Eleazar had called it judgment, saying the faithless must perish so the pure could survive. His convictions silenced the doubters, but a shadow of guilt lingered in every glance between the men. Blood, even righteous blood, had its own memory. While Masada endured in isolation, Jerusalem devoured itself. The Temple Mount became a battlefield where rival warlords fought for fragments of faith. Fires consumed the city before the Romans even breached its walls. Starving families clawed at their neighbors' doors. By the time Titus's legions encircled the city, nothing was left to save. He built his siege lines with the precision of ritual, raising banks and towers that crawled closer by the day. When the end came, it came in fire. The temple that Titus had meant to spare caught flame, and the gold from its roof ran molten down the steps. The hills trembled beneath the cries of the dying. On the plateau of Masada, the defenders saw the glow long before the survivors reached them. For a night and a day, the horizon burned as if dawn had been trapped in place. When the first messengers arrived, their faces were grey with dust and disbelief. They spoke of streets paved with corpses, of the ark lost forever, of priests slaughtered on the altar. The Romans had filled the city with crosses until the hills looked like forests. Eleazar listened in silence. When the tale ended, he raised his hand and said that the fall of Jerusalem was not an ending, but a purification. Their people had once wandered 40 years before reaching the promised land. Perhaps now they must wander again before redemption. His voice did not tremble. The others bowed their heads, and none dared call the ruin by its name. Defeat. Night deepened across the desert. The wind rose, hot and dry, sweeping through the fortress like a breath from the furnace of God. Eleazar walked the walls alone, the sand hissing around his feet. Below him, the cliffs dropped into the pale stillness of the Dead Sea. Beyond that lay the empire, endless, ordered and hungry. He had fought its soldiers, had seen their iron discipline and their cold mercy. He knew they would come again. Rome did not leave embers smouldering. It crushed them beneath the heel until the ashes forgot they had ever burned. By morning, the refugees from Jerusalem began to arrive, hollow-eyed, barefoot, carrying the silence of their city on their backs. Some came seeking sanctuary, others simply a place to die. They brought with them stories of desecration and slavery, and the fortress, once a symbol of resistance, began to feel like a tomb waiting for its occupants. The Sicarii still prayed, still trained, still spoke of divine vengeance, but doubt had seeped into their bones. Eleazar could feel it. He answered it with new promises, speaking of visions and covenants renewed upon the mountain. "This is our Sinai," he told them. "The fire that devoured Jerusalem shall temper us like iron." Each dawn he stood on the northern terrace where Herod had once greeted the sunrise. The murals were cracked, the columns chipped, but the view was as it had been in the king's day. The desert unbroken, the Dead Sea shining like a mirror of quicksilver. The fortress seemed eternal, yet even eternity could be besieged. He knew that somewhere beyond the horizon, the Romans were gathering again, and that the man chosen to end this war, Flavius Silva, was already preparing his legions. Silva was a soldier of method, not passion. He had marched under Vespasian and watched empires rise and crumble in civil war. Now he ruled Judea in the emperor's name, determined to finish what Titus had begun. From Caesarea, he summoned the 10th Legion, veterans hardened in the flames of Jerusalem, and with them thousands of auxiliaries from Syria and Arabia. For fewer than 1,000 defenders, Rome would send 8,000 men, siege engines, and architects of destruction. The empire never balanced its scales. It buried what opposed it. Eleazar heard of these preparations through traders and shepherds, and each report sounded like the tolling of a distant bell. He made no speeches now. He ordered repairs to the walls, counted the stores, measured the water, and walked through the fortress in silence. The place felt haunted, Herod's shadow in every corridor, the echo of murdered soldiers in the halls. Yet to the zealots it was still sacred ground, the last sanctuary of a faith unbroken. By the year's end, The desert lay still beneath a hard white sky. The wind carried no more news from the north, only the faint clang of memory. At night, the stars seemed closer, as if leaning down to witness the final act of a story already decided. In the darkness, Eleazar would close his eyes and hear the rhythm of distant marching, imagined, perhaps, but too steady to be dismissed. The empire was coming, drawn by the same inevitability that pulls vultures to carrion. Masada had waited 7 years for the war to find it again. Now it would, long before the sound of Roman trumpets ever reached the desert. Masada had been a monument to one man's fear. Herod the Great, king by Roman decree and distrusted by his own people, had looked upon the plateau and seen safety. To him, it was not a wilderness, but a wall against the world. In his mind's eye, enemies marched endlessly across the horizon. Rivals, assassins, even the caprice of Rome itself. So he built a refuge that could defy all of them. The fortress was not merely strong, it was extravagant, a palace carved into the bones of the mountain, where solitude masqueraded as power. When the Sicarii arrived nearly a century later, they found Herod's ghost waiting in every chamber. His halls were silent but unspoiled, storehouses heavy with grain, amphorae of wine sealed in resin, great cisterns still able to catch and hold the rare desert rain. Marble columns leaned over tiled courtyards once meant for feasting, and on the northern cliff, a palace of 3 descending terraces looked out over the Dead Sea, a vision of luxury suspended above emptiness. Herod had planned it as a sanctuary for one man. The zealots made it their ark. The first thing they did was strip the walls of ornament. Gold leaf, plaster, mosaic. All signs of the old king's vanity were hacked away or left to peel. The frescoes that once gleamed in red and azure grew dim beneath the smoke of their cooking fires. The echo of sandals on marble gave way to the scrape of steel and the murmur of prayer. They turned bathhouses into granaries, shrines into armories. Each room that had once celebrated opulence now served survival. What Herod had built to insulate himself from rebellion became, by grim symmetry, the final fortress of rebellion itself. To the Sicarii, the transformation felt like divine irony. Herod had been the Romans' creature, half Idumean, half opportunist, and yet his labor now sheltered those who despised the empire most. Some saw in this the hand of providence, others a cruel jest. Eleazar ben Yair called it justice. Even the tyrant built unknowingly for the righteous, he told his men. His words hung in the cool air of the palace like a benediction none dared question. Still, the rebels could not live by faith alone. The plateau was rich in stores, but poor in mercy. It had water, yet every drop depended on winter rains. It had food, but much of it was decades old. They learned to ration and to repair. Herod's ancient mechanisms, cisterns, channels, stone sluices, still functioned, but only through constant labor. Men carried water in jars up the steep paths, while women ground barley left from the king's stores into coarse bread. Children learned to read by tracing letters in dust beside Roman shields captured years before. At night, the desert grew vast and cruel. Fires burned low for fear of drawing attention, and those who kept watch along the walls spoke in whispers. The fortress stood so high that the world below seemed unreal, a sea of shadows beyond the reach of sound. Yet every now and then, the wind brought voices, traders from the Dead Sea coast, Bedouin herdsmen, fugitives from the north. From them came fragments of the empire's pulse, new governors in Caesarea, levies drawn from Syria, rumors of soldiers rebuilding roads that led south. Among the zealots, unease began to stir. Their 7-year hold felt less like triumph than postponement. The youngest among them, boys who had never seen Jerusalem except as smoke on the horizon, asked what they were still fighting for. Eleazar told them they fought for the name of God itself, for a world uncorrupted by idols. Yet even he knew how thin faith could wear when it was fed only on prophecy. To keep discipline, he sent raiding parties into the lowlands, not against Roman camps, which were too distant, but against Jewish settlements accused of compromise. The most infamous of these raids struck the oasis of En-Gedi. The Sicarii descended at dawn, blades drawn, demanding food and tribute. When the villagers resisted, the zealots cut them down. 700 lay dead before the day was done, and their stores were carted up the mountain. The slaughter haunted even the victors. Some claimed to hear the cries echo from the ravines at night, mingling with the howl of jackals. But Eleazar declared the raid righteous, a warning to those who would trade peace for servitude. Purity, he said, cannot live beside corruption. None dared answer him. The fortress changed with each season. Gardens of barley and lentils sprouted in patches of thin soil near the western wall, fed by the runoff of the cisterns. The air smelled of dust and oil, sometimes of blood. From the northern terraces, the zealots could watch the entire world that was left to them. The pale mirror of the Dead Sea, the faint outlines of Moab across the water, the endless white desert stretching to the horizon. They had made a kingdom of absence. For all its grandeur, Masada could not protect them from memory. The rebels told stories around their fires, of Jerusalem's markets before the revolt, of families lost to Roman slavery, of prophecies whispered by the Essenes who had once lived near Qumran. They spoke of vengeance, but also of longing. Some dreamed that angels would descend and smite the empire. Others prayed only that their children might live to see freedom. The fortress became a crucible for both faith and doubt. Eleazar walked among them each night, a figure both revered and feared. His leadership rested not on gentleness, but on certainty. When food ran low, he rationed his own share first. When disputes flared, he invoked scripture. Yet behind his eyes burned a weariness he never spoke aloud. He had seen too many victories end in ruin, too many martyrs forgotten. Still he believed that Masada was different, that here, high above the reach of ordinary men, they might carve a covenant into the stone itself. To test his followers, he ordered a rebuilding of Herod's outer walls. Stones loosened by time were replaced. Towers raised higher. The work kept them busy and gave the illusion of progress. It also reminded them how small they were. Every block had to be hauled by hand, every layer of mortar mixed from sand and salt. When the winds blew, dust stung their eyes and filled their lungs. Yet each evening, as the sun fell behind the Moab hills, the walls caught fire in the fading light, and for a moment the fortress looked reborn. That vision sustained them through the next years. Travelers who glimpsed Masada from the desert floor spoke of lights flickering along the heights, of chants carried on the wind, of a people who seemed half alive, half legend. The Romans ignored them at first. Judea was quiet, its rebellion extinguished. But the empire had a long memory, and the name of Masada lingered like a wound unhealed. When new legions rotated through Jerusalem's ruins, veterans spoke of the Sicarii who had killed their comrades and vanished into the cliffs. The officers listened and took note. By 72 AD, rumors reached the fortress that a new governor had been appointed. Flavius Silva, a man known for his order and restraint. He was said to be preparing a campaign to erase the last symbol of defiance in the province. The Sicarii heard his name with unease. They had survived plague, famine, and fire. But Rome's patience was endless. Soon enough, the desert would tremble again beneath the tramp of legionaries. On the eve of the first sighting of Roman scouts, Eleazar stood upon the northern terrace where Herod had once surveyed his kingdom. The frescoes had faded to ghosts, but the view was eternal. The lifeless sea, the wasteland of salt and stone, the boundless sky. He thought of Herod then, a man who had built out of fear and ruled through terror, and wondered whether they were so different. Both had believed that walls could save them. Both had mistaken survival for victory. The thought chilled him more than the night wind. Behind him, the fortress slept, unaware that its story was drawing toward its last siege. The wind whispered through the broken halls, rattling the jars in the storerooms, stirring the dust of a dead king's dreams. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Rome was awakening. The world that Herod had built to protect himself was about to become the stage for one final reckoning between power and faith. The wind never stopped on the heights of Masada. It moaned through the stone corridors and whispered against the ramparts, a constant reminder that the fortress stood alone between earth and heaven. Within its walls, life had hardened into ritual. The men rose before dawn to pray, facing the fading stars. Women gathered water from the cisterns and baked the coarse bread that tasted of dust and salt. Children played among the stones where Herod's courtiers had once walked, chasing shadows across mosaics cracked by time. They called themselves the Sicarii, those who carried daggers beneath their robes. The name had once been a whisper of fear in Jerusalem's markets, a mark of vengeance and fanatic devotion. Years before the city fell, they had stalked the crowded streets, striking collaborators in the press of festivals and vanishing into the alleys. To their enemies, they were murderers. To themselves, instruments of purification. When the revolt began, they joined the wider cause, dreaming of a new kingdom ruled not by Rome, but by divine law. At first, their fury had served them well. They fought in the alleys of Jerusalem, on the hills of Galilee, wherever Rome's banners appeared. Yet their zeal made allies uneasy. Even other rebels called them uncompromising, driven more by prophecy than by strategy. When rival factions sought truces or alliances, the Sicarii answered with steel. One by one, they withdrew from the greater struggle, retreating into isolation. Masada became their refuge and their prison, the one place where their purity could not be diluted by compromise. Their leader, Eleazar ben Yair, was both commander and priest. He was not old, but the years of war had carved severity into his face. The others looked to him with reverence that bordered on fear. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words cut like the wind, sharp, cold, impossible to escape. He had once studied the Torah under the teachers of Jerusalem, and he believed the revolt was not only political, but sacred, a cleansing fire meant to restore covenant with God. Defeat, to him, was a test, not an end. Inside the fortress, Eleazar's authority was absolute. He decided who fought, who prayed, who fasted. His judgments carried the weight of prophecy. He told them that to live beneath Rome was to sin, and that freedom lay only in obedience to heaven. His followers accepted this without question, yet doubt simmered beneath their devotion. Some whispered that the zealots in Jerusalem had been punished for arrogance. Others feared that the destruction of the temple meant God had withdrawn from them entirely. Still, no one dared speak such heresy aloud. Even in their isolation, the Sicarii clung to ceremony. Each week they gathered in the great hall where Herod had once feasted, now stripped of its finery. There, beneath the smoke-blackened ceiling, they read from the scriptures and sang the Psalms of David. Their voices rose against the stone and fell again into silence. The air smelled of oil and sweat, the sound of the wind merging with their prayers. Faith had become their sustenance. Without it, hunger and despair would have devoured them long ago. Among the women, devotion took quieter forms. They tended gardens in the thin soil, cared for the wounded, and taught their children the stories of deliverance. Some had lost husbands and sons in the wars. Others had followed their families here from villages erased from the map. At night, when the men stood watch, the women gathered near the northern terrace, telling tales of angels walking in the desert, of Elijah's fire on the mountain, of the promise that the righteous would one day rise again. Their voices wove the sound of hope through the silence of the stones. But hope could not erase the memory of what they had done. The massacre at Ein Gedi still haunted them. It had been Eleazar's order, though none dared remind him of it. The survivors of that day carried the memory like an unspoken wound. The children who had been too young to fight now asked about the blood spilled in God's name. Their questions hung in the air unanswered, dissolving into the desert wind. Faith demanded sacrifice, and Eleazar knew how to demand it. When food grew scarce, he ordered longer fasts. When tempers frayed, he declared days of prayer. He told his people that suffering made them worthy. They obeyed, though obedience no longer brought peace. Their prayers were no longer petitions, but pleas, half hope, half fear, that their struggle meant something in the eyes of heaven. The fortress became a mirror of their minds, enclosed, austere, self-contained. Each morning began with discipline, training, repairs, meditation. Every man carried his dagger as though it were a relic. The blades were kept sharp, though they had no enemies near enough to strike. Children learned to polish the weapons, their reflections wavering in the steel. To them, the daggers were symbols of holiness, the tools through which their fathers had purified the world. Sometimes, Eleazar would climb the western slope at dusk to watch the sun fall beyond the Judean hills. There, the desert stretched infinite, every stone glowing red as if the land itself smoldered. He would stand alone for hours, tracing the shape of the sky. The thought came to him often that they were already dead, living only because Rome had not yet remembered them. Yet within that thought lay a strange freedom. The living still feared defeat. The dead feared nothing. Rumors drifted to them through wanderers and shepherds. Rome had rebuilt its garrisons, new roads carved across the province, new governors enforcing tribute. The name of Flavius Silva reached Masada like the whisper of a coming storm. The man was said to be relentless but measured, one who believed in order above cruelty. He was gathering an army in Jerusalem, the survivors of the 10th Legion who had crushed the city, men hardened by 4 years of siege. For them, Masada was unfinished business. Eleazar listened to these rumors with calm detachment. He had expected them. Every empire must finish what it starts. He told his followers that their task was not to escape, but to endure, to hold out until God himself intervened. Some believed, others merely nodded. The line between faith and resignation had blurred. Still, they prepared. Weapons were sharpened, walls strengthened, stores rationed. Every task became an act of devotion. In private, Eleazar's resolve wavered. He dreamed of the temple as it had been before the fires, the altar gleaming in the dawn, the psalms rising like wings. He woke each time to the dry rasp of the desert wind and the weight of silence pressing against his chest. The fortress had begun to feel less like sanctuary than tomb. He wondered whether their struggle had ever been holy. or whether pride had merely disguised itself as faith. One night, he gathered his closest followers in the great courtyard. The moonlight fell white across the stones. He spoke of endurance, of how every trial refined the soul. "We are the last," he said, "and in being last, we are chosen." His words carried through the stillness, and for a moment even doubt seemed to bow before them. The others repeated his vow, that they would die free rather than live enslaved. The sound echoed against the cliffs, swallowed by the desert below. When dawn broke, the fortress looked unchanged. The women prepared bread, the children fetched water, the men patrolled the walls. Yet something invisible had shifted. They had bound themselves not only to each other, but to an ending they could no longer escape. Beyond the horizon, the Roman army was already on the march, its banners glinting in the sun. The Sicarii would soon meet their mirror. Discipline against fanatic faith, order against defiance. Masada's silence waited for the sound of approaching war. In the wake of Jerusalem's ruin, Judea lay broken, but not still. Roads once choked with pilgrims now carried soldiers and slaves. The debris of a shattered province swept beneath Rome's methodical hand. Fields burned during the rebellion were being surveyed anew. Taxes were tallied, temples rededicated to the gods of the victors. To the empire, peace was not the absence of war, but its harvest. And for those who administered it, every scar in the landscape was a reminder that order must be replanted again and again. From Caesarea came a man suited for the task. Flavius Silva, governor and legate of the 10th Legion, was the empire made flesh, disciplined, unsentimental, and perfectly obedient. He had served under Vespasian and Titus in the Eastern campaigns, had seen the walls of Jerusalem collapse stone by stone, and had learned how swiftly fanaticism could ignite an entire province. His appointment was no accident. Judea was a wound that Rome could not allow to fester, and Silva was chosen for the slow surgery of conquest. He began as all Romans did, by counting. He ordered surveys of the region, recorded the names of surviving settlements, and mapped the remnants of rebel strongholds. His scribes drew lines across parchment tracing rivers, roads, and fault lines, marking where legions could march and where water might be found. He met with merchants and scouts, gleaning the mood of the land. What he heard confirmed the Senate's fears. Isolated groups of zealots still roamed the desert. The name of Masada was spoken in whispers, as a haven for the most dangerous of them, the Sicarii. For Rome, the fortress was more than a military nuisance. It was an insult. No empire could tolerate defiance on such a scale, especially not from men who styled themselves prophets and killers of Romans alike. The emperor's peace depended on spectacle as much as justice, and the destruction of Masada would prove both. The message would be clear. There were no mountains high enough, no gods fierce enough to shield rebellion from the reach of Rome. Silva set about preparing his campaign with the patience of an engineer. He reviewed the 10th Legion, 5,000 veterans who had already endured the horrors of Jerusalem, and reorganized them into cohorts fit for desert warfare. Alongside them, he assembled auxiliary units from Syria and Arabia, men who knew how to fight in heat and thirst. Supply chains were laid out from Hebron to the Dead Sea. Water convoys were arranged, mule trains laden with grain and timber. Siege equipment was repaired and reassembled. The vast wooden machines that had battered Jerusalem, now destined for another mountain. The logistics of the desert tested even Roman mastery. Between the coastal cities and Masada stretched miles of barren salt plain. Scouts reported that no stream flowed within 10 miles of the fortress. Every drop of water would have to be carried, every meal rationed. Yet the legionaries did not complain. They were men tempered by siege, disciplined, methodical, confident in the invincibility of their order. To them, Masada was not a mystery, but a problem to be solved through labor. Silva understood the psychology of conquest as much as its mechanics. He knew that fear was more powerful than force, and he intended to use both. When he marched south in early 72 AD, he did not hide his movement. Trumpets announced his progress through every town. Banners caught the sun, so that distant watchers would see the red eagles advancing. Villages surrendered before the soldiers even reached them. The war was already won in the minds of the terrified. Only Masada remained outside the empire's shadow. From the ridge above Engedi, Silva first saw the fortress rising from the desert, like an island in a sea of stone. It was smaller than he had imagined, but infinitely more imposing, a perfect geometry of nature and defiance. The mountain's sheer cliffs gleamed white under the sun, its summit invisible behind a crown of heat. For a moment he felt the admiration that every builder feels before destruction. Then he began to plan. He established his main camp on a plateau to the west, where the ground was firm and high. From there, he could see the full sweep of the Dead Sea and the serpentine paths leading up to the fortress. Engineers measured the distance to the summit and studied the slope. A direct assault was impossible. The eastern face was sheer and the snake path too narrow for an army. Only from the west, where a natural spur of rock jutted toward the mountain, could siege works be raised. Silva ordered the site marked with stakes. Each decision followed the rhythm of Roman precision. He divided his forces into cohorts assigned to specific duties, one to build the rampart walls of encirclement, another to guard supply lines, others to quarry stone for the siege ramp he already envisioned. Around the base of the mountain, he ordered a continuous wall to be built, a circumvallation stretching nearly 2.5 miles, punctuated by 8 camps. It would keep the rebels in and hope out. The plan alone inspired awe among his officers. It would become one of the most enduring examples of Roman siegecraft ever recorded. At night, as fires burned across the desert plain, Silva walked the perimeter of his camp. The wind carried sand through the tents, whispering against the armor of sleeping men. He wondered whether the defenders on the heights could see the lights below, and if they did, whether they felt fear. He thought of the Sicarii not as barbarians, but as reflections of his own discipline turned inside out. Men of conviction without reason, courage without obedience. Such enemies were dangerous because they did not recognize defeat. Still, he admired their audacity. Rome had crushed empires greater than Judea, yet these zealots persisted as though faith alone could fill the gap between spears and stones. He knew better. No wall could resist the patience of legions. The siege might take months, perhaps a year, but it would end the same way all sieges ended, with exhaustion, hunger, and surrender. And when the fortress fell, Rome would not simply reclaim a mountain. It would reclaim the narrative of power itself. From the walls of Masada, Eleazar watched the dust rise on the western horizon. To his eyes, it looked like the desert itself had begun to move. His scouts counted banners and standards, the glint of metal in the sun. He said nothing at first, only studied the approaching columns. The prophecy he had preached for years was at last manifesting. The empire had come for its final reckoning. Some of his followers rejoiced, believing the end would summon divine intervention. Others trembled, recognizing that the might of Rome was a force beyond miracles. As the sun dipped below the Moab hills, the first cohort of the 10th Legion reached the base of the mountain. They raised their camp in silence, as if they had done this 1,000 times before. Fires flared, shadows lengthened, and the sound of hammers echoed up the cliffs. From above, the zealots saw the order of it all, the squares of tents, the measured paths, the disciplined rhythm of construction. It was as if the earth itself had begun to obey the invader. Silver watched the fortress fade into shadow and felt the same calm that comes before inevitability. Every siege began in uncertainty, but he had never doubted its end. Masada would fall. The only question was how long the mountain would take to yield. As darkness spread across the desert, the stars emerged one by one above the ramparts, and both besieger and besieged looked upon the same sky, each certain that heaven favored his cause. The march south had taken weeks. The road from Jerusalem to the Dead Sea lay scorched under the spring sun, a corridor of dust where even carrion birds hesitated to fly. For the men of the 10th Legion, the desert was an enemy of a different kind, one that offered no glory in its defeat. They trudged forward with faces wrapped in cloth, armor dulled by sand, eyes stung by light. Mules groaned beneath their loads of timber, grain, and water. Every few miles, the legate ordered wells to be dug, though most yielded only brine. When at last they reached Masada, the legionaries halted and stood in silence. The mountain seemed to rise straight out of the earth, sheer cliffs ascending to a flat crown where the fortress glimmered in the distance. To the Romans, it looked less like a fortress than a vision, half real, half mirage, floating between the copper sky and the silver sea below. Some swore they saw figures watching from the ramparts, dark silhouettes against the blinding light. Flavius Silver surveyed the terrain with the eyes of an engineer. The eastern face was hopeless, a sheer drop toward the Dead Sea. The snake path that twisted up from below was too narrow for an army to ascend. Only the western approach, a slope of rock that reached toward the mountain like a frozen wave, offered a possibility. He could almost see, in the angle of that slope, the outline of the ramp he meant to build. Before siegecraft came containment. Silver ordered his men to surround the mountain. Within a day, stakes were driven into the sand, marking the course of a great wall, nearly 2.5 miles long, encircling the entire base of the plateau. It would be their circumvallation, the outer ring that would hold the fortress in isolation. Along its length, they began erecting 8 fortified camps, each positioned to guard a segment of the ring and to watch the others. At night, their fires traced a perfect circle around Masada, a halo of red points beneath the dark cliffs. From the heights, the zealots saw it and understood. The world below had become their enemy. Camp A lay on the northern slope, nearest the narrowest ascent. Camp B, largest of all, housed the Legion's command and siege engineers. To the west stood Camps C and D, their lines marching outward in geometric precision. To the south, on higher ground, Camp F guarded the water convoys and served as Silver's headquarters. The smaller camps dotted the rest of the ring, their earthen ramparts soon packed hard by the sun. From above, the formation looked like a chain drawn tight around a throat. The work was relentless. Soldiers cut stone from nearby ridges, hauled timber from the sparse wadis, and mixed clay into mortar that dried almost before it was spread. Sweat streaked the dust from their faces. Armor left raw marks on their shoulders. Even the wind offered no relief, carrying heat like breath from an open furnace. Yet the rhythm of Roman labor never faltered. Every hour had its order, every motion its command. They were building victory from the ground up. Eleazar watched from the upper terraces, his followers gathered behind him. The sight of the encampments filled them with both awe and dread. From sunrise to dusk, they could see the legions moving like an army of ants, thousands of men shaping the desert with their will. At night, the fires gleamed in rings, each one mirrored in the black glass of the Dead Sea below. The rebels began to speak in whispers, fearing that the mountain itself was being bound by invisible chains. Within Masada, preparations took on new urgency. Scouts reported every movement below, and sentries lined the walls from dawn to dusk. The zealots inspected their stores and found them still abundant. Grain, oil, dried fruit, water sealed in cisterns deep beneath the rock. Herod's foresight had made starvation unlikely, yet Eleazar knew that sieges were rarely won by hunger alone. Morale, not supply, would decide how long they could endure. He gathered his people in the great courtyard to speak. His voice carried against the wind, calm and measured. "The empire has come," he told them, "but the mountain is older than empire. These cliffs have seen kings rise and fall. If we hold our faith, this place will become the altar of freedom." His words drew murmurs of assent, though none failed to notice how far below the Romans had already begun building roads to haul their engines forward. For the men in the camps, the siege had the monotony of endless labor. They worked in teams, cutting and stacking stones, constructing watchtowers, laying wooden tracks for the movement of supplies. Engineers sketched the future ramp in wax tablets, calculating angles and load weights. The fortifications rose quickly. Even the desert seemed to bend beneath the discipline of the legions. Scouts brought reports of no resistance in the countryside. Masada stood alone, the last spark of the revolt flickering above them. Each evening, when the day's heat began to die, Silva walked the line of camps. He moved quietly, stopping to speak with centurions, to inspect the foundations, to measure progress. The air smelled of oil and sweat, the rhythmic clang of hammers echoing from the rocks. He felt the satisfaction of order restored. The rebellion had been chaos. This, in contrast, was civilization asserting itself one stone at a time. Sometimes he would pause and look up at the fortress glowing faintly in the last light. From that distance it seemed small, fragile even, but he knew how deceptive the mountain could be. Its walls were thick, its cisterns deep, its defenders desperate. He remembered the years of the Jerusalem siege, the tunnels, the countermines, the fires, and vowed not to repeat the mistakes of haste. Masada would fall, but on Rome's terms. Above, the zealots watched the encirclement tighten. Days became weeks, and still the Romans built, their pattern as precise as prayer. The defenders took turns at the parapets, trading shifts in silence. At night, the fortress was restless. Some claimed to hear voices in the wind, whispers from Jerusalem, calling them to vengeance. Others dreamed of angels descending in flame to scatter the legions. Eleazar neither dismissed nor encouraged such visions. He understood that faith was all that kept them from despair. By midsummer, the circle around Masada was complete. 8 camps stood linked by the wall, each visible from the next. Supply routes from Hebron and Engedi fed the army with water and grain. From the main camp, the beginnings of a ramp could be seen rising against the western slope, a rough scar of stone and soil creeping toward the walls above. Its shadow lengthened with every sunset. The zealots tested their strength in small ways. At night, a few crept down the cliff paths, loosing arrows into the darkness before vanishing into the rocks. They did little harm, but reminded the Romans that the enemy was still watching. In response, Silva doubled the sentries and ordered the work to continue even by torchlight. The ramp rose by inches, unstoppable, inevitable. Life in the camp settled into rhythm. Trumpets marked the hours. Guards rotated with precision. The men found strange comfort in routine. The universe reduced to tasks measurable and achievable. Each hammer stroke on stone was a promise that chaos could be mastered. They sang as they worked, voices rough with dust, echoing across the valley where the air shimmered with heat. Inside the fortress, the days blurred into sameness. The children no longer asked when the Romans would leave. They had learned that sieges end only in two ways. Women stored grain and prayed over it, blessing what they knew might one day be their last meal. Men kept their weapons clean and their spirits taut. Every night, Eleazar walked the ramparts alone, gazing down at the glowing ring of camps. He could see their fires reflected in the Dead Sea, as if two armies existed, one on earth, one in water, both encircling the mountain. He thought of the years since they had fled Jerusalem, of the friends lost, of the cause that had begun as liberation and turned into survival. The empire below seemed eternal, its machines patient as time itself. Yet he whispered a prayer to the wind, that Masada would not be remembered as a tomb, but as testimony. The desert kept its silence, the stars unblinking witnesses to what both sides already knew. The siege had truly begun, and there would be no turning back. Winter crept across the desert like a patient animal. The nights grew colder, the wind sharpened its edge, and frost bloomed faintly along the stones before dawn. From the ramparts of Masada, the zealots could see the Roman camps glimmering below, small fires scattered like constellations fallen to earth. The sight never changed, day after day. The ring of empire held fast. Inside the fortress, time began to blur. The defenders counted days not by the sun, but by sound, the rhythm of hammers echoing from the western slope. The ramp the Romans were building rose a little higher each morning, its slope creeping toward the fortress like a wound that would not heal. The zealots had no way to stop it. The cliffs were too steep to charge down, their weapons too few to strike far. Arrows loosed from above fell harmlessly against the shields of soldiers who barely looked up. Flavius Silva had turned patience into warfare. He allowed the siege to unfold as slowly as the seasons. The circumvallation wall was complete, the supply routes secured, and the ramp grew taller each day. The legions worked with the endurance of machinery, shifting stone and sand by hand and basket. Thousands labored under the watch of engineers who marked every inch of progress. When one cohort finished, another took its place. The work never ceased, not even at night. The fortress might as well have been besieged by time itself. For the Romans, the standoff was almost peaceful. The desert had become an enormous camp, its order maintained by discipline and routine. Soldiers drilled between tasks, inspected their armor, and recited the daily rites of the legions. Letters were written home and sealed in wax, though few would ever reach their destination. To pass the hours, they carved dice from stone and played by the light of the fires. The younger men whispered about the women they had left behind. The veterans spoke of other wars, Britain, Parthia, Germania. Every man believed that when Masada fell, this would be his last campaign before returning to the green world beyond the sea. Silva watched it all from his headquarters on the western hill. His tent stood apart, facing the mountain directly. Each morning, he studied the ramp's progress, noting how the gradient shifted, how the stone wall at its crest drew closer to the fortress gate. He knew the zealots watched him as well. At times he imagined their eyes upon him from above, following his movements as he wrote his dispatches to Rome. In his letters, he reported steady progress, no losses, no disorder. The truth was simpler. He was wearing the enemy down without ever striking a blow. Up on the plateau, Eleazar ben Yair understood exactly what Silva was doing. Rome's true weapon was not the sword, but inevitability. Every day that passed without combat was a victory for the legions. Yet he refused to let despair take root. He turned endurance into faith. The Lord tests those he loves, he reminded his followers. As the ramp rises, so does our salvation. But even faith can tire. Some of the men began to question whether deliverance would ever come. The women bore the weight of waiting in silence. They kept the children busy, grinding grain and fetching water from the cisterns. The stores remained plentiful. Herod's provisions had aged well, though they lacked flavor and hope alike. The air in the storerooms was dry and lifeless, the smell of dust and oil heavy in the lungs. Some whispered that the abundance itself was a sign of irony, that the fortress had been built to preserve life, but now only prolonged their suffering. Archaeologists in later ages would find that much of this food had indeed survived, though not the bodies that guarded it. Tensions flared among the zealots, disputes over rations, over faith, over the meaning of God's silence. Eleazar settled each with the same cold certainty. Doubt is Rome's ally. He imposed strict watches, rationed speech as much as water, and forbade talk of surrender. The fortress, though vast, began to feel small. Every echo in its corridors seemed louder. Every silence stretched too long. Below, the Romans continued their methodical labor. They sang to keep rhythm, their voices rising through the thin air, a low, steady chant that reached the heights like a taunt. The zealots hurled stones and curses, but neither found their mark. Some nights, when the moon was bright, the defenders could see slaves moving among the soldiers, dragging sledges of rubble toward the growing ramp. Eleazar recognized their faces, captives from the villages near Hebron, perhaps even Jews taken during the siege of Jerusalem. The Romans used them as shields, knowing the zealots would not fire upon their own. The tactic worked. Anger turned inward. Weeks passed, indistinguishable from one another. The ramp rose until it met the level of the western wall. The Romans reinforced it with wooden beams, cross-braced and layered with clay to resist fire. From the top of the mountain, it looked like a road carved out of the living earth, a path that led from the empire's heart straight to their gates. The defenders watched in helpless awe. Their mountain, once impregnable, was being transformed into their enemy's ladder. During one sleepless night, Eleazar climbed alone to the northern terrace. The air was cold and sharp, the stars fierce above him. He looked down upon the Roman lights and thought of the long chain of history stretching before this moment, of Egypt's pharaohs, of Babylon's kings, of all the conquerors who had risen and vanished. He wondered whether Silva ever considered such things, whether he saw himself as a man or merely as Rome's instrument. Perhaps that was the secret of their power, that they believed not in gods, but in procedure. By midwinter, the fortress had become a world unto itself. The zealots marked time by prayer and maintenance, by the sound of children coughing in the cold nights. The cisterns still held water, but the men grew gaunt from rationing. The women no longer sang. In the silence, they could hear the scrape of the Romans' shovels far below, each stroke echoing like a heartbeat. Some claimed they could feel the mountain tremble, as though resenting its own betrayal. One afternoon, a scout brought word that the Romans had begun constructing a siege tower on the ramp's upper slope. From its ironclad sides would rise artillery and a battering ram, the instruments of final breach. The news fell upon the zealots like a curse. They had known this moment would come, yet hearing it spoken aloud tore the last veil of denial. Eleazar gathered his men and urged them to hold fast. "Let the tower rise," he said. "The higher they build it, the farther they will fall." Silver, in his camp, watched the tower's skeleton climb against the sky. Each beam, each plate of iron, each nail was a note in his symphony of conquest. He gave no speeches, demanded no glory. The work itself was victory enough. When the tower stood complete, gleaming under the desert sun, he ordered a halt to the ramp's construction. The mountain was ready to be taken. For the defenders, there was nothing left but waiting. The wind turned colder, sweeping down from the Moab highlands, carrying the taste of rain that never came. The children fell silent, the mothers prayed without sound. Eleazar walked the ramparts at dusk and watched the Romans testing their machines. The siege had lasted months, yet the moment of decision was near. Below him, the ramp cut a scar across the desert, a monument to Rome's will. Above him, the stars burned indifferent. Between them, Masada waited, suspended between faith and annihilation. By early spring, the desert had fallen silent except for the grinding of stone. The ramp that rose along Masada's western slope had become a mountain within a mountain, a monument to Roman persistence. Under the glare of the sun, it shimmered like molten bronze, a scar that glowed against the pale cliffs. From its base to its crest, it stretched nearly 100 meters high, packed with rubble and timber, bound together by clay that baked into hardness each day. The sight was terrible and magnificent at once. The work had taken months of labor and an army's patience. 10,000 men, soldiers, and slaves alike moved in endless rhythm, hauling baskets of earth, rolling boulders into place, hammering wooden braces until their hands bled. They toiled from dawn until the stars rose. Some sang to keep time. Others cursed the mountain's silence. The ramp consumed everything: sweat, strength, and human lives. A few of the forced laborers collapsed under the heat and were buried in the very stones they had carried. Silver ordered no burials elsewhere. The ramp would entomb them as part of its structure. Above, the Sicarii watched with growing dread. Day after day, they had seen the slope creeping upward, devouring the distance between the Roman camp and their fortress wall. At first, they had mocked it, certain that the desert itself would turn against such ambition. But the ramp did not wither. The Romans brought water from miles away to keep the clay firm, and even the wind seemed powerless to scatter their progress. Soon, the defenders could see the outlines of engines on the ramp's rising spine, the scaffolding for the siege tower taking form. Eleazar ben Yair stood on the western rampart each morning, his cloak snapping in the wind. The sight filled him with awe and a grim admiration. He had expected the legions to assault the mountain with fury, to burn their way upward in chaos. Instead, they had built. Each day of construction was a sermon on discipline, and each stone laid was a declaration that Rome's patience was infinite. He saw now why their empire spanned the world. In the fortress below, fear began to ripple through the zealots. The ramp's progress was impossible to ignore. Children who once played in the courtyards now pressed against the walls to glimpse the growing monster below. Mothers whispered prayers while preparing food that none had appetite to eat. Men sharpened weapons they knew might never be used. The sound of hammering from the Roman camps had become the fortress's heartbeat, steady and inescapable. The zealots tried to fight back in whatever ways they could. Archers stationed on the western towers loosed arrows and stones at the laborers below, but their missiles fell short or shattered harmlessly against shields. The Romans had anticipated every angle of attack. To protect their workers, Silva ordered Jewish prisoners, captives from nearby villages, to be driven before the soldiers as living shields. When Eleazar saw them through his spyglass, his breath caught. He recognized the faces of his own people, gaunt and terrified, forced to labor for their enemy's victory. His men wanted to fire anyway, but he forbade it. "We do not strike our brothers," he said. Yet the restraint burned like poison in their veins. Below, the legions advanced with the same indifference as the tide. Silva moved among his men without ostentation, his presence enough to keep the work in motion. He knew that victory in siegecraft was not measured by speed, but by the collapse of the defender's hope. The ramp would rise until the mountain bowed to it. Each boulder rolled upward was another prayer to Roman order. At night, the campfires flickered across the plain, reflected in the still surface of the Dead Sea. The ramp, faintly lit by torches, seemed alive, its shadow shifting against the cliffs. The desert had become a vast amphitheater, Rome building the stage for its final act. The fortress above glowed dimly, its torches small and scattered, like the last embers of a dying fire. Inside the walls, Eleazar gathered his followers in the hall, once built for Herod's feasts. The frescoes were fading, the plaster blackened by smoke, but the air was thick with the weight of expectation. He spoke of faith and endurance, reminding them that the Lord had parted seas and leveled walls before. His voice carried deep and calm, yet behind it lay the knowledge that miracles did not answer every prayer. He urged them to stand fast, not for victory, but for witness. "The Romans build with stone," he said, "but we build with spirit. Let them see what cannot be conquered." His words steadied them for a time. Yet outside, the ramp grew. From the terraces, they could now see Roman soldiers walking its surface, testing its strength, driving stakes for siege towers. The realization spread that the fortress's isolation, their greatest defense, was vanishing before their eyes. The mountain was being unmade. When the ramp reached 2/3 of its height, the Romans began reinforcing it with timber scaffolding. The beams creaked under the weight, bound by ropes and plastered with clay. From afar, it looked like a second wall, rising to meet the first. The zealots could see oxen pulling massive carts laden with stone, mules dragging timber across makeshift roads. The sound of the construction echoed through the ravines, until even the silence seemed to hum with it. By the first days of March, the ramp's crest touched the lower battlements of Masada's western gate. Silva climbed to the upper platform of the siege ramp and looked upon the fortress face to face. The air was dry and sharp, the distance between enemy and empire measured in a few hundred feet. He turned to his engineers and gave the order to begin the final assembly. Within days, the siege tower rose above the ramp, a colossal structure sheathed in iron plates to defy flame, its height greater than the walls it faced. From the top of Masada, the defenders saw the tower gleam like a second sun. Terror mingled with fascination. No one had imagined such a machine could exist in this wilderness. Behind it, the ramparts of the Roman camps glowed in the firelight, a crown encircling the base of the mountain. It seemed that even the stars had bent into formation with the legions. That night, Eleazar stood alone on the western parapet. The wind carried the smell of oil and iron up from below. He watched sparks leap from the forges, where the Romans shaped the final fittings of their ram. His men slept uneasily behind him. The children huddled with their mothers in the inner chambers. He felt the pulse of the mountain beneath his feet and wondered how long before the first tremor of its fall. Far below, Silver walked the ramp's base with his centurions. He said little, content to let the mountain's silence answer his thoughts. Every conquest, he knew, was both triumph and epitaph. Masada would be remembered as proof of Roman genius, but also as testament to the futility of resistance. He thought briefly of the Jews above, of their stubborn faith, and felt no hatred, only the calm resolve of a man fulfilling his duty to history. By dawn, the siege tower was complete. Its iron plates caught the first light, and its shadow stretched across the ramp like the hand of an approaching god. Trumpets sounded in the camps, echoing through the ravines. The legions cheered, a single roar rising from 8,000 throats. The zealots answered with silence. They knew what the sound meant. The mountain that had sheltered them for 7 years had finally become the instrument of its own destruction. Dawn broke pale and brittle over the Dead Sea. A low mist clung to the salt flats, softening the edges of the Roman camps. For the first time in many months, there was no hammering, no shouts of labor. The ramp had reached the fortress wall, and the legions stood ready. When the trumpets called, the desert trembled. From the height of Masada, the zealots saw the enemy move like a single organism. Lines of soldiers unfurling their standards, engineers checking the bindings of ropes and pulleys. The siege tower loomed above the ramp, its iron plates glinting in the morning sun. Beneath it hung the battering ram, a monstrous beam shod with bronze, suspended by chains that creaked under its weight. The men below stood in silence until their centurions signaled the advance. Flavius Silver had waited for this day with the patience of a builder. He had tested every part of the ramp, every wheel of the tower, every rope. He did not shout orders. He merely raised his hand, and the machine began to move. The tower rolled forward on its massive wheels, the ram swaying like a pendulum. Behind it came ranks of archers and slingers, ready to cover the engineers from the defenders above. The first stones fell from the fortress before the tower had reached its halfway point. Arrows hissed downward, striking the iron plates and splintering harmlessly. The zealots hurled jars of oil and burning pitch, but the metal shell of the tower drank the fire and sent it running off in harmless rivulets. Smoke curled into the sky, a black thread twisting between the two worlds, the besieged and the conquerors. Silver watched from the base of the ramp, his face expressionless. The battering ram swung forward, struck the wall, and thunder rolled across the cliffs. Dust poured from the impact, the sound echoing from ravine to ravine. Each blow followed the next with measured rhythm, the heartbeat of inevitability. The defenders answered with a storm of missiles, but the machine did not falter. Every strike loosened the stones of the fortress wall a little more. Inside the gates, Eleazar ben Yair stood among his men, his voice steady though the walls shuddered. He ordered reinforcements to the western side, knowing that was where the final breach would come. The zealots dragged heavy stones and timbers, building an inner barricade behind the outer wall. When the battering ram finally broke through, they would meet the Romans with fire and fury. The courtyard rang with hammer blows as they worked. Children carried baskets of sand to douse flames. Women tore linen for bandages before there were wounds to bind. Everyone moved with purpose, though none could disguise the fear beneath their haste. By noon, the sun stood directly above the ramp, a white eye glaring upon both sides. The Romans advanced the tower until it stood close enough for the archers at its crest to fire directly into the battlements. Stones and arrows fell in unending rain. The zealots crouched behind their walls, shooting back where they could, but the air had grown thick with dust and heat. Each breath tasted of salt and ash. Silver gave the order to bring forward the scorpions, small torsion engines that hurled iron bolts into the fortress. The bolts struck with a whine and thud, punching through shields, embedding in the plaster walls. The defenders could do little but endure. They prayed aloud, the psalms rising over the roar of engines. When the first breach appeared in the western wall, a cheer went up from the camps below. The rams struck again, and the gap widened, stones crashing down the slope. The Romans pressed their advantage, dragging the tower closer, its wheels grinding over the ramp's packed surface. Eleazar saw the dust plume rising and knew the moment had come. He shouted for the defenders to ignite their reserves of pitch and wood. The inner barricade they had built burst into flame, a wall of fire roaring behind the breach. Smoke filled the air, choking both armies. The Romans hesitated, their tower shrouded in black vapor. For a moment, it seemed the fire might halt them, but the wind shifted. The flames turned inward, carried back against the fortress by the desert's breath. The zealots fell back, shielding their faces. Sparks leapt toward the ramparts. Beams cracked, and the barricade burned to embers. Through the smoke, the ram struck once more, its blows muffled but relentless. As afternoon waned, Silver called a halt to the assault. The wind had grown erratic, the air thick with heat. He ordered the tower drawn back to prevent damage from the spreading fire. The soldiers withdrew in disciplined lines, leaving the ramp littered with debris. From the heights, the defenders watched in wary disbelief. They had survived the day, though at a cost they could not yet measure. Eleazar gathered his people in the courtyard as night approached. The walls still smoldered, ashes drifted like snow across the stones. He spoke softly, his voice carrying in the still air. "We have withstood their first storm," he said, "but tomorrow they will come again. Strengthen what you can, and do not despair. The Lord does not abandon his own." His words steadied them, though each man and woman understood the truth. The Romans had merely paused, not retreated. Down below, Silver walked among his engineers, inspecting the damage. The tower's iron shell was streaked with soot, but intact. The ramp had held firm. He ordered repairs through the night. To his officers, he spoke calmly, even approvingly. "Tomorrow," he said, "we finish." That night, the desert was a furnace of heat. The fires of the siege tower cast long shadows across the ramp, and the stars seemed to flicker in sympathy. Inside Masada, no one slept. The defenders took turns on watch, their eyes fixed on the campfires below. Mothers rocked their children without lullabies. Men prayed in whispers, each word an unspoken farewell. The mountain itself seemed to listen. Toward midnight, a wind rose from the west, sweeping the smoke toward the sea. From the terrace, Eleazar watched it flow outward like a tide receding. He saw the glow of the Roman fires reflected in the water and felt the weight of destiny settle upon him. The empire was patient, and patience always triumphed over defiance. He understood then that Masada would not survive another dawn. Below, Silver stood at the edge of the ramp and gazed upward. The fortress loomed dark against the stars, its walls broken and smoking. He imagined the people inside, fanatics, as Rome called them, yet steadfast beyond reason. Part of him, the soldier's part, respected their resolve. But admiration had no place in duty. At sunrise, he would send the tower forward again. When morning came, the desert was eerily still. The wind had died, leaving a silence that felt deliberate, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Roman trumpets sounded once, twice, calling the legions to formation. From within, the fortress came no answer. No taunts, no arrows, not even a cry. The soldiers began their final ascent, step by step, up the ramp they had built from the bones of the earth. The sun climbed behind them, casting their shadows long across the stones. Silver raised his hand, and the tower rolled forward once more. The ram swung in perfect rhythm, crashing against the weakened wall. Dust billowed outward, cloaking the mountain in smoke and gold. When the breach finally yawned open, the sound was like the snapping of the world's spine. He gave no order to rush in. The men expected it, thirsted for it, but he held them back. Dusk was falling, and he had no wish to waste soldiers in confusion. At dawn, he said. We go at dawn. From the ramparts, Eleazar watched the Romans withdraw to their camps for the night. He felt no relief, only the quiet certainty of ending. The wall was broken, the path open. Tomorrow the empire would come through. He looked out across the desert and whispered a prayer that was neither plea nor surrender. Behind him, the fortress lay silent, every soul within waiting for the final dawn. Night had descended without stars. The air over Masada hung still and heavy, filled with the lingering taste of smoke. From the breach in the western wall came the slow crackle of cooling stone. Each fissure popped like a distant footstep, a reminder of the enemy who waited just beyond the darkness. Inside the fortress, no one spoke above a whisper. The children slept in clusters beneath the ruined arches. Women kept silent watch, holding them close. Among the men, there was no more pretense of hope. The Romans would come with the sunrise, and every man, woman, and child on the mountain would meet them. Eleazar ben Yair walked alone through the corridors of Herod's fortress, the torch in his hand throwing long shadows that quivered over the ancient murals. His sandals echoed on the stone floors, where courtiers had once walked in luxury. Now the air reeked of soot and fatigue. He passed storerooms still full of grain, jars sealed against dust, amphorae of oil untouched. The abundance mocked him. Josephus would later write that the zealots had left their provisions deliberately unspoiled, to prove they had not died from want. Eleazar understood the symbolism before it was conceived. Starvation would not be Rome's victory. When he reached the central courtyard, the last of his captains were waiting. Their faces were drawn and streaked with ash. No one asked for orders. They knew none remained. The ramp was complete, the tower poised for the final strike. All that was left was choice, death by the sword or by their own hands. For a long moment, Eleazar said nothing. He looked at the men who had followed him for 7 years, soldiers, farmers, scholars turned rebels. Many had lost everything before coming here. Their faith had carried them through hunger, siege, and despair. Now it would be tested in its purest form. We have lived free upon this mountain, he said at last, his voice low but steady. Tomorrow the Romans will take our walls, our children, our bodies, but they cannot take our will unless we offer it. The men listened in silence. A few nodded. Others lowered their eyes. He continued, his tone gathering force. When they entered Jerusalem, they slaughtered without mercy. We saw what they did to the holy places. To them, our lives are nothing but spectacle. If we surrender, they will drag us in chains, make us march in their triumphs. Is that the fate you want for your children? To be trophies in their games? A murmur rippled through the hall, half agreement, half unease. One of the older zealots rose, his beard matted with dust. The Lord forbids self-destruction, he said. Life is his to give and take. Would we not sin by doing what only he may do? Eleazar turned to him. The Lord gave us freedom, he answered. he entrusted us with its keeping. If we live to be slaves, we betray his gift more surely than if we die guarding it. His words struck like hammer blows against the stillness. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Some of the men looked toward the doorway, where the faint orange glow of Roman torches flickered against the ramp. The sound of distant voices drifted up. The enemy's laughter carried on the wind. It hardened their resolve. One by one, heads began to nod. Yet doubt remained, unspoken but heavy. The women had not been told. The children slept unaware of what the dawn would bring. Eleazar dismissed the men to bring their families to the great hall before sunrise. When they were gone, he remained alone, leaning on his staff. His reflection shimmered faintly in a pool of oil spilled from an overturned jar. He thought of the prophets and of Abraham's willingness to sacrifice what he loved most. Was this, too, an act of obedience, or merely despair wearing holiness as a mask? The thought passed, leaving only exhaustion. He was a man, not a prophet, but history would remember only his choice. Before dawn, the entire community gathered within the courtyard. Torches lined the walls, their flames bending in the wind. Women clutched their children. The men stood behind them like sentinels carved from the rock itself. Outside, the first pale light began to edge over the desert, revealing the distant glint of Roman armor. The fortress was a single heartbeat of humanity, suspended between darkness and conquest. Eleazar stepped forward, his cloak torn, his eyes hollow but unafraid. His voice, when he spoke, carried to the farthest wall. Brothers and sisters, the hour has come. The ramp stands ready, the enemy waits. If we surrender, they will enslave our sons and dishonor our daughters. They will turn our courage into mockery. But if we choose death on our own terms, we will be free. Not even Rome can conquer those who die unbroken. A woman cried out, clutching her child. Another shouted that it was blasphemy to take innocent lives. Eleazar lifted his hands for silence. We do not kill in hatred, he said. We offer ourselves to God, as our fathers offered burnt offerings on the altar. Let our souls rise to him together, pure and untainted by chains. The crowd wavered. Some wept openly, others sank to their knees. A younger zealot, barely 20, raised his dagger and shouted that he would die as his ancestors had lived, without bowing to any mortal king. The cry spread through the hall, echoing from the stone until it sounded like the roar of an army. Yet not all hearts yielded. Several men withdrew to the corners, whispering that God would yet intervene, that suicide was not martyrdom, but despair. Eleazar's gaze fell upon them with sorrow rather than anger. He knew faith could not be commanded, it must be chosen. Still, he feared division more than death. A divided people invited Rome's triumph, even in their dying. He lifted his voice once more, softer now, weary but resolute. If you cannot do this for faith, then do it for mercy. Better that we die by love than that our children die by hate. As he spoke, a shadow passed across the fortress, the brief dimming of dawn as clouds moved over the sun. It felt like an omen, though none could say for what. When the light returned, Eleazar ended his speech with a final plea. Let us meet God as free men. Let no Roman defile what we have sanctified with our struggle. Silence followed, deep and absolute. Then the murmur of assent began again, spreading through the crowd until it became a single voice, unified by dread and conviction. The decision had been made, though its weight crushed every heart that bore it. Even so, not all believed. Among the women was one who had followed Eleazar from Jerusalem, a distant relative of his by marriage. She had listened in silence throughout his speech, her face hidden beneath her shawl. When the assembly dispersed to prepare for the night, she slipped away with her children to a cistern chamber below the palace. She had no intention of dying for any cause. Her survival would one day carry the story of what happened here to the ears of Rome itself. As darkness settled for the final time, the fortress grew still. Men embraced their families. Prayers were whispered, then ceased. Eleazar walked among them like a shepherd, taking count of his flock before the slaughter. His steps were slow, his expression unreadable. Somewhere in the distance, a single Roman trumpet sounded. Perhaps a change of watch, perhaps the first signal of dawn. He looked toward the breach in the wall, where the ramp's shadow stretched upward, like a path carved into the night. Tomorrow that path would be filled with soldiers. He knew they would find nothing alive. He whispered a final prayer, not for victory, but for remembrance. Then he turned back toward the hall where his people waited, the decision sealed in silence. The night thickened, heavy with the smell of oil and ash. Within the great hall of Masada, torches burned low, their flames trembling against the stone. Families huddled close together, the air around them dense with unspoken terror. Beyond the broken walls, the desert lay in perfect stillness. But inside the fortress, the breath of every man and woman hung suspended, waiting for the end. Eleazar ben Yair stood at the center, his dagger sheathed at his side. He spoke little now. Words had carried them as far as they could. What remained required only resolve. The council's decision had been final. They would meet death as free people, not captives in Rome's triumph. The order of dying had been agreed upon in whispers, first the families, then the men who remained. He looked upon them not as a leader, but as one among the condemned. Many had followed him for years, through the fall of Jerusalem, through hunger and exile. Now they waited for him to begin what he had demanded of them. For a moment he hesitated, overcome by the enormity of what faith required. Then he raised his voice, quiet but unyielding. Let us give what Rome cannot take. Our lives are our last offering. The crowd moved slowly, like a tide. Mothers kissed their children and led them to the inner rooms. The men followed, each carrying a blade or spear. No screams pierced the air, only a low murmuring of prayers. The same psalms that had echoed through the temple before it burned. They believed their souls would ascend together, carried on the desert wind to the presence of the Almighty. Outside, the Roman camps lay silent. A faint glow from the watchfires painted the base of the mountain red, but the legions themselves slept or waited, unaware that their enemies were already slipping beyond conquest. The only sounds that reached them were the sighing of the wind and the dull thud of stone settling in the ramp. Within the fortress, the sequence unfolded with ritual precision. Each man turned his weapon against those dearest to him, wives, sons, daughters, so that none might suffer violation or slavery. The acts were swift, unadorned by ceremony, performed in trembling silence. Eleazar walked among them, offering prayers and comfort. He saw faces turned upward in trust, in agony, in disbelief. He had preached courage for years. Now he was learning its cost. When it was done, the remaining men gathered once more in the courtyard. Around them lay the bodies of their families, wrapped in cloths and placed side by side, the torches flickering over their still faces. The fortress was silent except for the faint crackle of burning wood. Eleazar spoke again, his voice hoarse. The Romans will find our bodies, but not our submission. Let them see that the spirit of Israel cannot be enslaved. It was then that lots were drawn to choose who would end the others. A jar was brought forth, filled with shards of pottery, each inscribed with a name. The pieces were small, worn from years of reuse, perhaps once ration tokens, now turned to instruments of destiny. Eleazar knelt beside the jar, his hand steady. He drew the shards, one by one, until 10 men were chosen. They stepped forward without hesitation, their faces pale but resolute. He gave them their charge. Each would walk through the fortress, striking down those who waited. When none remained but they themselves, one would slay the other 9. The last would take his own life, committing their souls to God in unity. The chosen men bowed their heads, murmuring assent. They understood that obedience in death was the final act of faith. The killing began quietly. Steel whispered through the corridors, followed by the soft thud of bodies falling. The torches dimmed, one after another, as their bearers perished. In the upper chambers, Eleazar stood alone, listening to the rhythm of ending. The fortress had grown vast in its silence. Somewhere far below, a child cried out once, then no more. He leaned against the cold stone and prayed that heaven was merciful enough to forgive conviction taken to its limit. When the footsteps of the chosen men approached, he turned to face them. The leader of the 10, a broad-shouldered man whose name Josephus would never record, met Eleazar's gaze. Neither spoke. The moment required no words. Eleazar closed his eyes and bowed his head. A single stroke, quick and practiced, ended the life that had defied an empire. The executioners moved on. Their blades flashed in the torchlight, each act deliberate, without pause. In time, only the 10 remained. They gathered in the courtyard once more, surrounded by the dead. The moonlight poured through the open roof, washing everything in silver. The leader spoke a final prayer for their people and for themselves, then turned to his companions. One by one, he fulfilled his charge until the last stood alone among the fallen. He walked through the hall, where children's toys lay scattered and the smell of oil still hung in the air. Reaching the terrace, he looked out across the desert. The Roman camps glowed faintly below, each fire a steady spark in the darkness. The ramp gleamed pale in the moonlight, a path built for conquerors who would never claim their prize. He dropped his dagger to the floor, then retrieved it, holding it as one might hold a sacred relic. Some say he hesitated, that for an instant the weight of the world pressed upon him, that his courage faltered. Yet he did what his duty demanded. The blade turned inward, and he fell beside the bodies of those who had followed his cause. The fortress lay still at last. No movement, no breath, only the soft hiss of the wind through the broken walls. The fires that had burned within Masada for 7 years flickered out, leaving nothing but embers. Far below, the Romans noticed nothing unusual. A watchman thought he heard a faint cry, but the desert has many voices, and he dismissed it. The night passed without alarm. Silver, in his tent, slept easily. His engineers had assured him that the wall would yield at dawn, that the victory was certain. He dreamed of order restored, of the empire's name carved once more into the stones of Judea. In the hours before sunrise, the wind shifted from the west, carrying the scent of burning oil up the ramp. A faint haze of smoke drifted from the fortress, though no flames could be seen. It was the last breath of the zealots' fire, consuming what remained of their world. When the first light touched the desert, Masada looked unchanged from afar. The same high walls, the same shadows stretching eastward. Only silence betrayed what had happened. Rome's enemy had vanished without a struggle, leaving the mountain to stand guard over their secret. A faint, colorless light crept over the desert, spilling across the Dead Sea like a slow tide over glass. In the Roman camps below Masada, men stirred from their tents at the first sound of the trumpets. They moved quietly, as soldiers do before a final assault. Armor was strapped on, javelins inspected, the scent of oiled leather mixing with the faint smoke that drifted from the mountain above. A strange stillness hung in the air. Even the mules were restless, snorting as though uneasy. Flavius Silva stood before his tent, scanning the fortress. The ramp lay silent, perfectly shaped after months of labor. Its surface hardened like stone. The breach gaped in the western wall, waiting for the order that would end the siege. He expected to see movement on the ramparts, a sentry, a defiant flag, the glint of a weapon. But there was nothing. The battlements stood deserted, dark against the growing light. He took it for deception. The zealots were cunning. Perhaps they planned an ambush behind the breach. He gave the signal to advance with caution. The first cohort formed in ranks, shields interlocked, steps deliberate and measured. Trumpets called out the rhythm, echoing across the valley. The tower rolled forward for the last time, its wheels grinding softly against the ramp's packed surface. The legionaries climbed the final stretch, the ramp vibrating beneath their feet. Every man braced himself for a storm of arrows that never came. As they neared the broken wall, the silence deepened, heavy as a tomb. Silva's adjutant turned to him, uncertain. The legate raised his hand, and the army halted. The wind picked up briefly, whispering across the stones, then died. "Forward," Silva ordered. They entered the breach. The air inside smelled of smoke and oil, but not of battle. Shields lifted, swords ready. They moved through the passage and emerged into the courtyard. The sight that met them stopped every man in his tracks. Bodies lay everywhere, men, women, children, arranged as though in sleep. Some held one another, others lay with faces turned toward the sky. The torches that had burned through the night still smoldered in iron sconces, and their smoke curling upward through the ruined roof. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was absolute, broken only by the crackle of cooling stone. Then one soldier muttered a prayer, and the sound seemed to free them all. Men crossed themselves, others swore under their breath. Even the veterans who had seen the worst of Jerusalem stared in disbelief. There was no sign of struggle, no wounds of combat beyond the self-inflicted. Masada had died by its own hand. Silva stepped forward slowly, his boots scraping against the dust. He looked down at a man whose dagger still lay beside him, the blade crusted but clean. "They denied us our victory," he said quietly. The words were not bitter, only weary. He had come to conquer an army and found a graveyard. The search began methodically, as Roman order demanded. Every chamber was entered, every passage explored. In the storerooms they found barrels of grain, amphorae of wine, and jars of dried fruit untouched. There were weapons, but few signs of battle. No broken shields, no arrows lodged in the walls. The soldiers moved with reverence now, their usual efficiency slowed by awe. It was as if they had stepped into a temple of death. From one of the cistern tunnels came the sound of weeping. The soldiers turned sharply, raising their torches. 2 women and 5 children emerged from the shadows, blinking at the light. Their clothes were torn, their faces smeared with soot. One of the women, older and gaunt, stepped forward and spoke in a trembling voice. Through an interpreter, she told her story. How Eleazar ben Yair had gathered his people, how they had chosen death rather than slavery. how lots had been cast to decide who would end the rest. She said she had hidden with her kin when the killings began, unable to lift her hand against her children. The men listened in silence. Even Silver seemed moved. The woman spoke of Eleazar's final words, his belief that their souls would be free when their bodies were ash. She described the moment the fortress fell silent, the last man's cry swallowed by the wind. When she finished, she covered her face with her shawl and would not speak again. Silver looked around at the ruin of the great fortress, at the bodies laid out in eerie calm. "Send word to Caesarea," he told his adjutant. "The rebellion is ended." His voice held neither triumph nor pity, only completion. The long war that had begun 7 years earlier in the streets of Jerusalem had at last run its course. Judea was pacified, its fire extinguished. Yet even in victory, unease settled over the camp. The soldiers who had expected spoils found none. There were no captives to parade, no treasures to seize. Instead, they walked among the dead, feeling themselves intruders. Some whispered that the Jews had cheated them of glory. Others felt a strange reverence, as though they had stumbled upon something holy. The desert wind rose and moved through the fortress like a spirit, stirring the shrouds of the fallen. By midday, Silver ordered the dead left undisturbed. The bodies were too many to bury, and the heat would soon claim them. The legionaries gathered what records they could, scroll fragments, weapons, tools, and descended the ramp. Behind them, the fortress lay as they had found it, a city of ghosts beneath a blazing sky. That night, from his tent at Camp F, Silver wrote his final report to Rome. His stylus moved with deliberate care, the words dry but exact. Masada taken. Resistance ended. Approximately 960 dead by their own hands. 2 women and 5 children survived. He added no judgment, no reflection, only the facts. To the Senate and the Emperor, the victory would stand as a testament to Roman perseverance. To Silver himself, it was an ending too quiet to be celebrated. As the report was sealed, he stepped outside into the desert night. The ramp glowed faintly in the moonlight, its curve leading up to the silent walls. Above, the stars shimmered in a sky washed clean of smoke. The fortress seemed peaceful now, indifferent to the Empire's triumph. He wondered whether the dead had found what they sought: freedom, absolution, or merely rest. The next morning, the garrison raised the imperial standard over the summit. The eagle of Rome caught the sun, casting its shadow across the empty courtyards. Drums sounded, trumpets blared, and for a brief moment the mountain echoed with the ceremony of victory. Yet the sound rang hollow, dissipating quickly into the vast silence. Masada had offered no battle, only a memory too heavy to bear. When the army finally withdrew, the camps remained behind, a ring of earthworks that would outlast the men who built them. The ramp stood unbroken, the most enduring monument to Roman engineering and to human despair. The fortress itself watched over the desert, untouched and unclaimed. Wind and sand would one day reclaim its stones, but the story of that morning would travel farther than any legion, carried by the 7 who lived to tell it. For now, the mountain kept its peace. The Dead Sea shimmered below, reflecting the light of an empire at its zenith, and the wind whispered through the ruins a truth neither Rome nor Judea could deny. Victory and ruin often share the same face. When the echoes of war faded, silence spread across the hills of Judea. The legions withdrew to Jerusalem and Caesarea, leaving behind their earthworks and their ghosts. Masada stood deserted, its ramp and camps bleaching in the sun. until they were indistinguishable from the desert that had once resisted them. The rebellion had ended, but its ash still hung in the air. The land was changed. Villages that had burned during the uprising were never rebuilt. Fields lay untended, their stones scattered where plows once turned the soil. The roads were safe again, but they carried only soldiers and slaves. Rome's peace was a quiet made of fear. For the survivors, freedom no longer meant rebellion. It meant permission to live. In Jerusalem, the ruins of the temple had become a quarry for Roman builders. Titus had spared a fragment of the western wall to mark his conquest. The rest was taken stone by stone, carted away to raise fortifications and shrines to foreign gods. Where the Ark of the Covenant had once rested, an altar to Jupiter now gleamed beneath the sun. The smoke of pagan sacrifice rose from the place where incense had once carried prayers to heaven. Some called it blasphemy, others inevitability. The few who had witnessed Masada's end told their stories, but few listened. To the scattered people of Judea, the fortress was a tragedy too remote to heal or to mourn. They had lost their city, their priests, their unity. Many turned inward, seeking faith in the household rather than the temple. The rabbis who survived began to gather in Yavne and Lydda, debating how to preserve what was left of the law without the rituals that had once defined it. The Great Rebellion had failed, yet its failure forced a rebirth. From ruin came a quieter strength, one built not on swords or kings, but on memory. Flavius Silva remained in the province for another year, restoring order and cataloguing destruction. He was not a cruel man, but he was a Roman, and for Rome, mercy was measured in usefulness. Those who cooperated were left to rebuild. Those who defied were erased. His reports to the emperor were written in the language of efficiency. Taxes collected, roads repaired, the province pacified. He never mentioned the night he entered Masada or the silence that had met him there. Rome had no need for introspection. It required only results. By 74 AD, Judea was declared subdued. Veterans of the 10th Legion received land near Emmaus, settlements planted like seeds of empire across conquered soil. Garrisons rose along the Jordan Valley to guard the frontier against Parthia. The desert, once a refuge for rebels and prophets, became a place for Rome's engineers to test the endurance of stone. Only the wind kept its freedom, sweeping over the abandoned camps, erasing footprints but not memory. In the villages that survived, the old songs returned in whispers. Mothers told their children of Jerusalem as it had been, the shining city on the hill, the temple where heaven and earth had met. They spoke of heroes and martyrs, of prophets who had promised redemption. They did not speak of Masada, for what could one say? That freedom had burned itself to ash on a mountaintop? That zeal had turned to slaughter, then to silence? Better to remember glory than despair. Among the Romans, the victory became legend. The ramp at Masada was cited in academies as proof of imperial genius. Engineers studied its gradient and structure. Commanders spoke of Silva's patience as the ideal of siegecraft. Yet beneath the admiration lay unease. Even hardened soldiers whispered of the mountain where an entire people had chosen death. The ramp, they said, led not only upward to conquest, but downward into memory, a reminder that fear could make men powerful and powerless at once. Years passed, and the desert reclaimed what men had built. The camps sank into dust, their walls collapsing under wind and rain. Nomads camped among the ruins, unaware that they slept where legions once stood. Masada became a landmark without a story, its silence too complete to invite retelling. Only a few pilgrims climbed the plateau to see the bones of Herod's palace and the blackened remains of the zealots' final fire. Those who came spoke of contradictions. The storerooms were still stocked with grain and wine, their jars sealed tight. There were no signs of burning beyond the inner chambers. The fortress had not been destroyed, only emptied. Archaeologists centuries later would puzzle over this. If the zealots had meant to erase themselves, why leave such careful order behind? Why preserve the food, the water, the tools? Perhaps, they thought, Eleazar had wanted the mountain to stand as witness, not ruin. Perhaps the untouched stores were his message to history, that they had died not from desperation, but from choice. The empire that conquered Judea did not remain unbroken. Within a generation, Vespasian was gone, Titus succeeded and died, and new emperors rose with new ambitions. Rome expanded eastward, westward, north into lands where even its legions faltered. Yet the memory of the Judean wars lingered, a warning about the price of faith. Governors invoked Masada whenever defiance flared, proof that resistance, no matter how righteous, always ended beneath the eagles. But faith, unlike armies, cannot be subdued. Across the empire, Jewish communities rebuilt themselves in exile. The diaspora spread to Alexandria, Antioch, Babylon, and beyond. In synagogues carved from homes and courtyards, prayers were recited for a land lost yet still promised. The Psalms of David, once sung in the temple, now echoed in foreign tongues. Masada's silence became part of those prayers, the pause between words, the moment of remembered loss. In time, Christianity too would inherit that silence. The followers of the crucified Messiah, born from the same soil, carried their gospel through the empire that had destroyed Jerusalem. They saw in the ruins a parable, the fall of the earthly kingdom giving way to a heavenly one. Yet even they could not ignore the power of the story on the mountain, the will of people who chose death over surrender. When word of the massacre reached Rome, senators praised Silva for his completeness. He was granted triumphal honors and later a consulship, the empire's highest reward. His name joined those of men who had conquered nations. But even as his star rose, he remained a figure of restraint, one who spoke little of glory. Those who dined with him said that sometimes, when the conversation turned to the wars, he fell silent and stared into the middle distance as if remembering a soundless battlefield. Perhaps he saw again the faces of those who had denied him victory. Masada endured long after he was gone. The mountain's stones outlasted the empire itself. They witnessed the coming of new conquerors, Byzantines, Arabs, Crusaders, and bore them all in silence. Yet in the stillness, one could almost hear the echo of that final night, the soft murmur of prayers, the fall of the last blade, the sigh of the wind carrying away the souls of the defiant. To the Romans, it had been the end of rebellion. To history, it was something larger, the moment when faith stood face to face with power, and neither triumphed. The empire built its monuments in marble. The zealots left theirs in dust. Both endure, but only one still speaks in the wind that passes over the Dead Sea. Wordless, eternal, unbroken. Years after the desert had swallowed the last embers of revolt, a man sat in a villa on the outskirts of Rome, writing the story of the war he had once fought against. Scrolls lay scattered across his table, their surfaces covered with the careful script of a survivor translating guilt into history. His name was Flavius Josephus, and though he lived under imperial favor, the ghosts of Judea haunted every word he wrote. He had been a commander once, a priest's son, who had believed he could defend God's people with strategy and reason. Captured in Galilee, he had spoken a prophecy to save his life, declaring that Vespasian, his conqueror, would one day be emperor. The prophecy had come true, and the conqueror had rewarded the prophet. Now Josephus served the dynasty he had once resisted, chronicling the fall of his homeland for the very men who had burned it. The irony was not lost on him. His pen had become his dagger, and each sentence cut both ways. In the quiet of his Roman study, he recalled the sound of flames devouring Jerusalem, the smell of smoke rising from the temple. He remembered the cries of the starving, the endless bodies hung on crosses beyond the walls. Yet it was not those horrors that troubled him most. It was the silence that followed. The world had been remade by conquest, and his task was to explain it. When he came to Masada, the story resisted him. He had not been there, yet he knew the outlines from survivors and Roman reports. The fortress, the ramp, the siege, and the end. 2 women had lived to tell of Eleazar ben Yair's final words. They spoke of 2 speeches, not one. The first uncertain, the second irresistible. The first had sown fear, the second had turned it into faith. Josephus saw in that duality something familiar, the struggle between conviction and despair that had marked all Judea in those years. He wrote as one who wished to understand rather than condemn. The defenders, he would later record, were of the fiercest kind, choosing death rather than bondage. His Roman patrons would have preferred a tale of fanaticism, a warning against rebellion, but Josephus shaped it into something subtler. He portrayed Eleazar not as a mad zealot, but as a tragic hero, a man who could not bend and therefore broke. In that portrayal, he found a reflection of himself, the rebel who had survived by yielding, now telling the story of those who had not. Each passage he composed carried the tension of that double life. His quill scratched across the parchment, shaping the memory of a people even as he softened it for imperial eyes. He described the speeches of Eleazar as if he had heard them himself, how the leader had urged his followers to see death as deliverance, how he had compared their souls to prisoners freed from their earthly chains. The words were too polished, too symmetrical to be transcripts. They were literature masquerading as history, and yet their resonance was undeniable. As he wrote, Josephus wrestled with questions that had no safe answers. Did he invent Eleazar's speeches to ennoble the rebels, or had he merely amplified what the survivors told him? Were his own memories of captivity seeping into the narrative, transfiguring the zealot's defiance into a kind of mirror confession? The historian in him sought accuracy. The penitent sought redemption. Between them, a legend took shape. He imagined the last night on the mountain as though he had walked among them, the torches flickering, the murmured prayers, the hiss of the final blades. He saw the silence of dawn when the Romans entered and found only the dead. Writing that scene, he felt both awe and unease. The rebels had achieved in death what he had failed to achieve in life, freedom from Rome's grasp. Yet their freedom was annihilation, and his survival was servitude. Both, he realized, were forms of captivity. The Romans who read his work interpreted it as vindication. They saw Masada as the empire's inevitable triumph, proof that rebellion was futile. But among Josephus's own people, the story began to live a second life. Copies of his writings traveled eastward, translated into Greek and later into tongues that would outlast empires. Each reader found a different message. Some saw martyrdom, others folly. Some read faith, others despair. The ambiguity was its endurance. In the margins of his drafts, Josephus made notes that revealed his unease. "What is victory?" he wrote once, in a hand so small it nearly vanished between lines. "To conquer is to impose silence. To survive is to speak of it. Perhaps he understood that memory itself is a form of rebellion, the only one Rome could never fully suppress. Outside his window, the gardens of his villa bloomed under the Italian sun. Slaves tended olive trees brought from the east, their roots nourished by foreign soil. He sometimes walked among them, thinking of the olive groves of Galilee, of the hills where he had once believed the world could be redeemed through resistance. The empire seemed eternal, but he knew better. He had seen cities rise and vanish in smoke. History was not marble, but dust held together by memory. In his later years, when his eyesight dimmed and his voice trembled, visitors would come to hear him speak of the Jewish war. He told the story calmly, without bitterness. Yet when he reached the chapter of Masada, his voice always changed. He described the Roman ramp, the siege tower, the silence that greeted Silva's men. He quoted Eleazar's final words as if from scripture, that the soul was free only when unbound from the flesh. Each time he spoke them, a shadow crossed his face, and he would fall silent for a long moment before continuing. Some who heard him believed the story had been embellished for drama, that no man could persuade hundreds to embrace death so willingly. Others thought the opposite, that Josephus had softened the truth to spare Rome's pride. He offered no clarification. History, he once told a guest, is a choice between what is remembered and what is forgotten. After his death, his writings were copied by scholars who knew nothing of the man himself. They read his account of Masada as one reads a fable detached from its author's torment. Centuries passed, empires changed, the words remained. The mountain, abandoned and silent, waited for them to return. Long after Rome had turned to dust, travelers found his scrolls and carried them back to the land he had left behind. When they read his story beneath the same sky where it had unfolded, they felt the breath of the past stirring again. The fortress still stood, the ramp still cut its line through the desert. Josephus's words became the bridge between the stones and the memory of those who had fallen. In time, his name would be argued over, traitor to some, historian to others. Yet without him, the mountain would have remained mute, its meaning lost to wind and sand. Through him, Masada lived on, no longer a fortress, but a parable. His contradictions became its heartbeat, surrender and defiance, faith and doubt, victory and ruin. The quill he had once feared to lift gave the dead their voices, and though he could never have known it, those voices would echo through centuries, carried by every generation that asked the same unanswerable question: which is greater, the courage to die for freedom or the endurance to live without it? Long centuries passed before footsteps once again climbed the mountain. Wind and sand had filled the ramp, smoothing the scars of conquest. The fortress that had witnessed such fury slept beneath layers of dust, its stones bleached by the sun, its silence complete. Travelers wandered the region, Bedouin herds grazed in the wadis below, and none could tell where myth ended and memory began. In the 19th century, explorers came with notebooks and measuring rods, guided by the stories that had traveled down through the ages from Josephus's scrolls. The first to record Masada's shape from the desert floor was a missionary and scholar named Edward Robinson. In 1838, he stood before the western cliffs and saw the ramp, eroded yet unmistakable, climbing toward the plateau. It seemed too vast to have been made by human hands. He marked it on his maps and wrote that this must be the mountain fortress of legend, the place where an entire people had chosen death. Other travelers followed, surveyors from Britain's Palestine Exploration Fund, engineers, geologists, and dreamers drawn by the stark beauty of the Dead Sea Basin. They measured the walls, traced the outlines of the Roman camps still visible as faint rectangles in the sand. From the air, these camps formed a near-perfect circle around the base of the plateau, the geometry of empire still intact. Even time had bowed to Roman precision. For decades, the mountain remained a curiosity, visited but not yet excavated. The desert preserved it better than any guardian. In the 20th century, the land around Masada entered another era of conflict and rebirth. When the State of Israel was declared in 1948, the ancient mountain, long forgotten, became a symbol waiting to be rediscovered. The new nation, forged in the shadow of exile and survival, looked to the past for stories that could bind it. None carried greater resonance than the tale of Masada. In 1963, archaeologist Yigael Yadin led the first major expedition to the site. Soldiers, students, and volunteers joined him, climbing the ancient paths as the Zealots and Romans had once done. They camped among the ruins for months, working beneath a sun that burned as fiercely as it had 2 millennia earlier. Each shovel of sand uncovered not only stones, but fragments of legend. Yadin found the remains of Herod's palaces, floors still painted with geometric mosaics, storerooms lined with jars, cisterns vast enough to drown in shadow. In the northern palace, 3 terraces cascaded down the cliff like steps toward the abyss. The view was unchanged. The same sea of salt, the same desolation. From that height, one could almost imagine Eleazar still standing at the rampart, watching the dust of the approaching legions. The Roman camps were mapped in detail, their low walls perfectly preserved. Even the circumvallation line was traced, a band of earth encircling the mountain like a scar that refused to fade. The ramp itself astonished everyone who saw it. Nearly 2,000 years old, it remained intact, the only complete Roman siege ramp known in the world. What Josephus had described in his writings was no embellishment. The stones and slopes spoke with their own authority. Inside the fortress, excavators found evidence of the zealots' daily lives. Fragments of pottery and lamps, coins bearing the inscription, "For the freedom of Zion," small scrolls written in Hebrew, scraps of sandals hardened by age. They uncovered a synagogue, simple but unmistakable, the earliest yet known in the land. In its benches and niches, they imagined the final prayers of the defenders, the echo of psalms whispered before the end. Yet not every discovery matched the legend. The excavations revealed contradictions that deepened the mystery rather than resolving it. The storerooms, said by Josephus to have been emptied or burned, were found filled with unspoiled grain and amphorae. No great fire had consumed the fortress. Only a few areas showed signs of flame. The food had not been destroyed as part of ritual denial, but remained sealed as if the defenders had expected to eat again. Then came the bones. Scattered through the ruins were fragments of human remains. Skeletal pieces, not the multitudes the historian had claimed. In total, fewer than 30 individuals could be identified. They were found near the northern palace, some burned, others entombed in sand. Who they were could not be known with certainty. Were they zealots, Romans, or later intruders? The answer remained buried in debate. The most haunting discovery lay in a small room near the northern wall. 12 clay shards, each bearing a name scratched in Hebrew letters. The names were legible even after 2,000 years. Yadin believed these were the lots drawn by the final 10 men, the very tokens Josephus had described. Others argued they were merely ration markers used to divide supplies. Yet when the archaeologists held them in their hands, the air seemed to thicken with memory. Each shard felt like a whisper from that last night, a moment suspended between history and faith. The team worked until the winter winds drove them down from the mountain. Their findings filled volumes, their photographs spread across the world. For some, the excavations confirmed the story's truth. The ramp, the camps, the human remains all testified to Josephus's account. For others, the evidence told a different tale, a siege exaggerated by time, a suicide transformed into legend. History had not been disproved, only complicated. The stones were impartial witnesses. Interpretation belonged to those who listened. When Yadin returned to Jerusalem, he called Masada a monument of courage and tragedy. In lectures, he spoke of the mountain as both fact and symbol, an archaeological site that had become a national myth. Soldiers swore oaths of service there, declaring that Masada shall not fall again. Tourists climbed the snake path to watch the sunrise over the Dead Sea, feeling themselves part of something larger than history, something eternal. But the mountain itself remained unchanged. At night, when the camps were empty and the wind rose from the sea, the ruins whispered with the same indifferent voice that had carried through the centuries. The ramp glowed pale beneath the moon. The Roman camps traced their perfect lines in shadow. No inscription marked where Eleazar had fallen. No monument identified the nameless dead. Only the desert held their memory, patient and impartial. For archaeologists, Masada was a puzzle of stone and silence. For the living, it was a mirror. Each generation saw what it wished to see: faith or fanaticism, martyrdom or despair, nationhood or warning. The mountain did not choose between them. It simply endured, its walls still bearing the weight of both legend and doubt. Today, those who stand on the summit see the same view that Herod saw, that Silver saw, that the Zealots saw before dawn. The Dead Sea glimmers far below. The desert rolls outward in endless folds, and the wind carries a sound that is almost speech. The stones do not tell who was right or wrong. They speak only of persistence, of the human will to build, to resist, to remember. And when the sun rises over the eastern cliffs, striking the ramp with gold, the mountain seems alive again, as if awakening from its long vigil. The shadows of the Roman camps stretch across the plain, and the silence deepens. Every morning, the desert renews the question that Josephus once wrote, and the historians tried to answer: what endures longer, the truth or the story that replaces it? At sunrise, the desert turns to gold. The Dead Sea lies below like a mirror, pale and still, reflecting the sky that once witnessed empires burn. From the heights of Masada, the world seems unchanged, empty, immense, indifferent. Wind slides across the plateau, whistling through the ruins, touching the same stones that once sheltered kings and zealots, soldiers and ghosts. The mountain endures, though everything that gave it meaning has passed into dust. The fortress stands open to the sky. Herod's palaces cling to the cliffs, their walls stripped bare by time, their mosaics faded to the color of bone. Roman camps still mark the plain in geometric scars, so perfect in shape that they look as though the legions departed yesterday. The great ramp remains, sloping upward with terrible serenity, its stones fused by the same sun that once scorched the laborers who built it. Each fragment of the place feels like a relic of something larger than human memory, a ruin not only of stone, but of conviction. Nothing stirs except the wind. It sweeps through the empty storerooms where jars still stand unbroken. moves through the narrow halls that once echoed with prayer, and gathers in the hollow of the northern palace where Eleazar might have stood, watching the desert burn at dawn. There is no sound of battle now, no human cry, only the murmur of the air as it rises and falls, as if the mountain itself is still breathing. To those who climb the ramp today, the ascent is silent but heavy. Each step presses into the same path once trodden by Roman soldiers who had thought themselves witnesses to a final victory. Yet what they conquered remains unconquered still. Their empire has vanished, their triumph turned to legend, while the mountain they besieged remains where it always was, unmoved, unbroken. The view from the summit stretches across eternity. To the east lies Moab, its ridges veiled in haze. To the west, the barren highlands where Jerusalem once shone like a jewel. The land below is both cradle and grave, the soil of prophets and empires, of beginnings and endings. Masada rises at its heart, neither sacred nor cursed, but something older, a witness to the futility and grandeur of human will. Here the story ends, though it never truly finishes. The siege of 73 AD marked the close of the First Jewish-Roman War, the extinguishing of organized resistance in Judea. Yet from that silence came endurance. The survivors who walked away carried more than grief. They carried the knowledge that faith could survive the loss of everything tangible. In their exile, they turned worship inward, building a covenant not of stone, but of memory. Out of defeat was born a religion that would travel farther than Rome itself. For the empire, Masada had been the last scar to cauterize. Flavius Silva was rewarded for his victory, promoted to consul, his name engraved in marble. To him, it must have seemed a conclusion, the pacification of a restless province. Yet history has a way of turning its conquerors into footnotes. His legions are long forgotten. His towers have crumbled. Only the ramp he built remains, more enduring than the empire that ordered it. Centuries later, travelers returned, their curiosity mingled with reverence. Pilgrims climbed the snake path, breathing the same hot wind that once carried the cries of the dying. Some came seeking God, others came seeking proof. They found neither, only silence, a silence so vast it seemed to swallow questions whole. When modern excavators uncovered Herod's palaces and the ostraca scratched with names, they realized that the mountain had preserved not answers, but echoes. That echo has become the voice of Masada, not the shout of rebellion or the sermon of Eleazar, but a quiet persistence that refuses to vanish. Each generation that looks upon the mountain hears something different. To some, it speaks of courage, to others, of despair. Some hear the warning of fanaticism, others hear the anthem of freedom. The mountain itself offers no interpretation. It allows every listener to inscribe their own meaning upon its stones. At dusk, when the sun sinks behind the western ridge, the desert cools and the shadows lengthen across the ramp. The light turns crimson, as if the earth remembers fire. The air grows still, and for a moment, the boundaries between past and present seem to blur. One can almost see the silhouettes of Roman standards on the plain, the flicker of torches winding upward, the faint gleam of bronze against the cliff. But when the wind returns, they vanish, leaving only the sound of emptiness. To stand upon Masada at that hour is to feel the paradox of history. The rebels who died here were defeated utterly, yet their defiance has outlived their destroyers. The Romans who claimed the mountain achieved victory so complete that it erased even their triumph. Both sides are gone, but their story endures, transformed, reimagined, retold, until legend and truth are inseparable. The stones remember without judgment. When darkness falls, the stars reveal themselves with startling clarity. They stretch across the sky in unbroken ranks, a celestial army unbothered by human struggles. Below them, the Dead Sea glimmers faintly, a mirror to the heavens. It is easy to believe that Eliza's followers, who spoke of freedom beyond the body, found what they sought in that vastness. Death had been their escape from empire, and in this boundless quiet, one might imagine their spirits still moving with the wind. The desert does not mourn, it simply receives. The camps of Rome erode year by year. The ramp endures, yet even it will one day sink back into sand. The mountain will remain, its edges softened, its stories blurred, until the world forgets the names of kings and prophets alike. But even then, some fragment of its defiance will persist, carried on the air that drifts across the valley. In the stillness before dawn, when the wind hushes and the stars fade, the mountain feels alive again. The air grows warm, the first light touches the ramp, and the desert awakens to another day exactly like the last. Nothing moves. Nothing needs to. The silence itself is the monument. Masada endures not because of what happened, but because of what it means. It is the memory of resistance and the inevitability of empire, the reminder that belief can outlast power. The Romans built their ramp to climb upward. The Zealots built their faith to rise higher still. Both remain, one carved in stone, the other in spirit. And as the sun clears the eastern horizon, flooding the cliffs with light, the desert returns to its eternal rhythm. The wind sighs through the ruins, the shadows shorten, and the voice of history fades once more into quiet. The mountain waits, as it always has, between heaven and earth, between the living and the dead, between memory and oblivion.